I want to ask you, what is the best way, first of all, to vet a tenant? What's the best way to screen a tenant?
Okay. The first step in screening a tenant, Matt, is making sure that the data you have is actually original data. The topic headline that you read through says how to lease a property in the worst when you have to lease it in the worst possible way is actually a little tongue-in-cheek, and I use that when I'm presenting to investors and investor clubs in and around the area because it's actually not what you think. Typically, I give the example of how to really screw it up, how to mess up, and where landlords get themselves in hot water and in deep financial distress by doing it wrong. So let's talk about the best way to screen tenants first of all. The best way is to never accept documents from the tenants without making sure they're original source documents. For example, a lot of times tenants will ask us, well, we just pulled our credit report because we were thinking about buying a house or this other landlord just had it pulled. Can we give that document to you? The absolute answer is no. You want to pull your original own source documents from the application that they fill out because, boy, there's a lot of easy ways to change credit scores, change the document with a computer nowadays, and you have to have the factual information to make a well-informed risk profile of the tenant. Second is make sure your process is consistent across the board. Matter of fact, the best way to do it is to document it so that you can never be charged with discrimination, in housing discrimination. And a lot of our smaller investors out there may not think about that if they only own one or two or even a half dozen rental properties. But if you don't have your screening process documented with specific criteria, eventually it's going to bite you. Somebody's going to be mad about you turning them down, and they're going to file a complaint with the Attorney General's office or Better Business Bureau or worst case scenario with HUD. And those are not fun to deal with.
No, they're not. And unfortunately, Dan, sometimes that self-imposed discipline where you have very specific processes for screening tenants, sometimes that means your unit may stay empty for another week or 2 weeks or maybe even a month. And a lot of landlords, I think a lot of landlords will go ahead and rent it out to a lower qualified person, ignoring their own rent criteria because they're so desperate to get a place rented. I think that's a mistake in the long run. What do you think?
It absolutely is. Here's a perfect story. I was actually working with a landlord late last night. It was a referral from an F.B. Tucker agent here in town. F.B. Tucker is a large brokerage company, and we do a lot of referral business from them to us because they don't do leasing and property management per se. So I'm talking with the owner last night, going through the application that I had just processed earlier that day. There were a lot of red flags. And I'm talking with the owner, and they're desperate. They literally moved out of the house 2 months ago. It's costing them their mortgage. I mean, they cannot financially carry this. And I was explaining to them, well, they've got, 520 credit score and 544 credit score. And they're like, well, but we're okay with that. We're okay. I go, I'm not done yet. There's some inconsistencies here on his credit score and his Social Security number. And I said, I asked the tenant, and they sent over a picture of his Social Security card. However, now here's the rub, Matt. The Social Security card looked legitimate. However, when I ran their credit report, the credit report showed two numbers totally different on the credit report from the service I used versus what his Social Security card was. So that's red flag number one. Red flag number two was his credit report and the reports came back with an entirely different date of birth than what he put on his application. Third red flag was he had three different aliases, none of them the same iteration or derivative of his first name and his last name. So as I was trying to tell the landlord to go through this, I could almost hear him over the phone wilting because he realized that it was a very tough position to push, and it was something that I was recommending him extremely urgently not to approve this tenant because we don't know who he is. We literally could not get factual information on, is this person who he says he is? And that's a deflating dialogue to have with a landlord, but that's what we're paid to do, to run that due diligence and build that risk profile for the landlord for their own protection. So a lot of times when landlords are trying to do their own tenant screening, they're willing to overlook these small inconsistencies. Well, boy, in the long run, when you have to evict a tenant and that tenant physically does not exist anywhere on the paper, you can't. You're squeezing blood from a turnip, and you as an attorney, your office knows that full well, and from having to prosecute these, you have to have the correct information going in order to make an informed decision. Otherwise, the outcome is a disaster. So, in the end, the landlord is very happy, and we're just going to keep pushing it for the next tenant. But sometimes you have to say no to secure your position. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and the importance of getting original documents, generating documents yourself to do the tenant screening is really important. That's actually a concept that applies all across the board for real estate professionals and investors. The example I always use is when you're buying an income-producing property and the seller tells you that the net operating income is $100,000 a year, or whatever it might be, $10,000 a year, say, you have to get original documents that allow you to verify what the NOI actually is. And one of the best documents to do that is tax return, because nobody overstates their income or understates their expenses on their tax return. So that's a great way of verifying what the NOI of a building really is. But until you get the original documents and you can verify raw data, people will lie to you, and they'll tell you pretty much anything to get into an apartment or a house.
They really will. Another example, Matt, that we see all the time is with self-employed tenants when they're applying to rent a property that we're leasing and managing for a landlord. Since they're self-employed, a lot of them won't have a regular payroll check to email or fax over to us. So we'll go with a backup source, which is very simply a bank statement, and we'll have them circle the deposits that relate to what they say they're getting on their payroll. We'll get other auxiliary documents prior to a final approval, but self-employed folks are tough to document, and obviously the same thing applies there. Self-employed people typically understate their taxable liability because they have so much to write off on their business, and so their income makes it harder to qualify. No different than on a mortgage loan. They're tougher, no doubt about it.